Okay, so we're going to be talking about gender issues in a disaster. And real quick, before we really get into it, I just want to briefly define disaster, and that's going to be any event that extends beyond the capabilities or the reach of local authorities at the local level, whereas an emergency is going to be handled at the local level. And here we have an example in the image down below. It's evacuation attempts, rescue efforts after Hurricane Harvey, which is an example of a disaster. Along with flooding and earthquakes, things like that. So, what is gender? Gender is going to be the social construct, these norms that we're taught, how to be a woman, how to be a man, how to be a girl, a boy, and I have some information on here that you can read through, but that's gender, whereas sex is your biological identity given at birth. And I have this image does a great job of differentiating between the two, saying sex is your chromosomes, your reproductive organs, whereas you have this, concept of gender identity, which is how you feel, which may not align with your sex, and then these gender norms that we have. So now that we've talked about gender and then now going specifically into women, are women more vulnerable to disaster? And the short answer is yes. Women and girls more often assume the role of caretaker, homemaker, and so they're in charge of, oftentimes young children, elderly, those with special needs. And so in the case of Hurricane Katrina, we see that this actually prevented women from being able to evacuate, and the majority of people left behind that could not evacuate were women because they were unable. So that's a really interesting inequality in that data. And then also, if we bring in a racial and economic aspect, disaster is going to exacerbate any and all inequalities. And so women and girls specifically, people of color, minorities, they're more likely to live at the poverty level. And so obviously they're going to be less equipped to handle a disaster. It could be their housing is not as well equipped to withstand a disaster as someone else is. Or in the aftermath of a disaster, they may struggle finding out, where to get aid from. And the recovery process is going to take a lot longer for them. Okay, so now just continued. I want to touch on that some cultures require modest clothing that may actually prevent women and girls from escaping. They may not have learned how to swim or climb trees because of cultural norms, so that can actually put their lives at danger. And then also pregnant women are more susceptible to being taken advantage of or being disadvantaged in a disaster, just obviously. So, what do women face in the aftermath of a disaster? Well, expectations placed on women and girls after a disaster, they're not going to lessen. And if anything, they're going to increase after a disaster. So, there's that aspect. And then there's also the sex crime and domestic abuse side of things, where, in cases of evacuations and rescue attempts, women and girls are bused to mass shelters. And there's so many people there, and people capitalize on the chaos of the situation and engage in deviant behavior, and we see sex crimes, we see spikes of human trafficking in the times immediately following a disaster. And then also, if people are forced to stay home, like in COVID-19 we had stay-at-home orders, and can you call that a disaster? Maybe if you twist it, but either way, we've got these women and girls staying home, whereas otherwise they may not have been home with their abuser all the time. And so that's a really important thing to look at too. So really quickly before we close out, what can be done about gender issues in a disaster? Yes, funding programs and listening to local groups kind of lead the way for what they need. Those are super important things, but the biggest contributor is probably going to be changing the way that we perceive and view sex and gender in our society, changing rape culture and things like that.